So this is my second video in the series about the Rockschool improvisation tasks from the debut syllabus. I'd originally planned to do this in 2 videos, but on reflection I've decided to make it into 3 just so I can break it down into more manageable chunks, because it is something that's been a little bit confusing for some of the students. So in the first video I looked at just trying to explain what is improvisation and what it actually means to be doing improvisation on an instrument. I'll put a link to that. In this video I'm going to have a look at just a few exercises and tips just to get you started, almost like a warm-up if you will, to prepare for doing the improvisation piece. And in the next video, the third part, I'll actually get the backing tracks out and we'll have a look at some examples of doing the improvisation as what is expected in the exam. So for this bit we're just going to have a look at the scale that we're going to be using and how we can take advantage of a little bit of knowledge to make the task a little bit simpler for us before we get fully into doing the improvisation bit itself. It tells us on the syllabus that we're asked to play an improvised part in the key of C major using the C major scale over a chord sequence or a chord progression, which if I remember is C, D minor and G. So they're all in the key of C major. Don't worry too much about when I'm talking about keys and stuff. The main thing to know about that is that the notes in the scale that we're going to use will definitely fit nicely over the chords on the backing track. That's one of the reasons that we use scales to play over certain chords. It gives us a structure and it gives us an idea of the right notes to play. There is a school of thought when you're playing music that there is no such thing as wrong notes. You can play anything you want. That is kind of true, but some notes will sound better than others, and when you're playing over a backing track it really does make a difference, because some notes will just sound wrong if you play the wrong notes. So by having a scale to play, it gives us a framework. It gives us a starting point to be able to make sure that every note that will sound okay, every note that we play will sound okay over the backing track. It might not sound fantastic and memorable when you listen to some music that's recorded by famous bands and popular music. Some of the sequences, they're instantly memorable and you think, oh yeah, that's that, when it comes on the jukebox, because of the way the musicians have played the notes. So just because we're playing the right notes doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound fantastic, but it's going to make sure that we don't play the wrong notes. So to start off with, the C major scale that's asking us to use, one of the other tasks in the debut syllabus is just literally practicing the C major scale. So the way that it's presented to us in the syllabus, the C major scale, obviously if you look at your music, you're able to read it. That's one of the exercises, that's a separate exercise that you need to do. So if you're not comfortable with doing that, I would suggest making sure that you're okay with that before going any further on this. If you're not comfortable with playing the scale just in that way, just straight up and down the scale, as I just did, if you're not alright with that, go back to the other exercise. I've done a video on that, I'll put a link as well. Make sure that you're okay at least to that point where you can play it to the required speed on the metronome. I'm not sure if it's 65 or 75, I can't remember. But you need to be okay with that exercise before even attempting this, because otherwise you'll be struggling from the outset. So with that said, all I was doing there was playing the notes of the scale, starting from the bottom and playing up in sequence to the top and then back down again. If we were to use that in improvising, that's fine, all those notes would sound fine over the chords, but it doesn't sound very imaginative, it doesn't sound very good. There's nothing in the syllabus that says you're not allowed to do that, but I would imagine, and the implication is when I've looked at the marking scheme, the examiner's scheme, that you'll be marked higher for using an element of creativity. So if you just play the notes up and down the scale, you haven't played anything wrong, but that's not really what they're looking for. They're looking for you to play those notes in different orders and create something new and original yourself, not just copy the scaling sequence from the other exercise. Now, if you're just used to playing the scale up and down, if you're just used to doing the scale exercise from Rockschool, that might seem like a confusing task because you're used to playing them a certain way. That's quite often how you start learning scales, because you start from somewhere, go to somewhere, and you get the notes into your hands. So hopefully, if you've done the other exercise on the scale, you'll be comfortable in actually playing the notes that are in the scale, as I've just demonstrated there. In order to play them in different orders, there's a few ways we can approach it. I can probably do it just in my mind because I'm quite used to improvising. That's something I've done a lot of. But if you haven't done it before, you might need something that's going to help you to get your head around the idea of it. What I would suggest for this is, rather than looking at the order of the notes, they're presented to you in tab in the other exercise, so it's telling you all the notes in which order to play them. Try and have a think about the actual shape of the scale. And when I say the shape of the scale, I mean, how would the note, if you were to see all the notes at once, what would they look like on the fingerboard of your guitar? So obviously start with, maybe start with your first note, that's C, that's one. Moving on to your other string. Just those two strings. I'm starting to see a little pattern of visually how the notes look, and start to imagine a shape of how they would look. I've got one of my students actually has a guitar that's got little sort of stickers of dots underneath the strings that have been used for some kind of practice or learning in the past, and that's a way of visualising for whoever was using the guitar which notes to play or which notes not to play. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you do that and go sticking things on your guitar fretboard, because it's just not a good idea and it'll sound awful and they'll probably just come off and leave glue everywhere. But what you can do, if you're used to looking at your chord charts, when you look at your chord chart, you'll see each chord is presented to you. There's a diagram of it, and it'll show perhaps a dark black line at the top representing the nut of your guitar, and then it'll show 6 lines coming down representing the strings of your guitar, and then it'll show a few lines going across for the frets of your guitar, and then it'll have little dots on to show you where to put your fingers for the chords. So for a G major chord, it'll have a little dot there for that note, a little dot there for that note. On the next strings, I'm not playing anything with my fingers, so we'll have a little O for that string, a little O for that string, a little O for the B string, and finally on the first string, the high E, it'll have a little dot there on the 3rd fret. So on a chord diagram, you're used to seeing those dots that tell you where to put your fingers. It might be a useful exercise to look at the scale in this way. I was going to upload a diagram of this C major scale shown with the little dots so that you could have a look at it and see it in that way. But then I thought, hang on a minute, there's a better way, and I hope you don't think I'm being mean and stingy. In my mind, in my teaching experience, a better way is for you to do it yourself, because you'll learn more from thinking it through and creating it, and that'll give you a head start in the entire exercise. So what I suggest you do to begin with is draw yourself out one of those little chord diagrams that's got the nut on, the 6 strings and the frets, only up to the 3rd or 4th fret. That's all you need, you don't have to do the full guitar. And then looking at the scale that's presented to you in tab on the Rockschool scale exercise, think about the notes that you're playing and put those as dots. Forget about the numbers, just put those as dots on your chord diagram, and then you'll have a scale diagram, and then you can visualise all of the notes in the scale. So without having to worry about the numbers on the tab, you can have a little picture of what the shape of the scale actually looks like. That will help you forget the order of the notes as they're played on the scale exercise, and you'll be able to focus a little bit more on the actual pattern, the bigger picture of all the notes, which ones you can play, which ones you can't play, and you can then pick from those and start to have a go at improvising. As a quick example, I know by looking at this scale, I know from playing it that 3 of the notes on this C major scale are actually open strings. So I've got my open D string, open G string and open B string. I'm not fretting anything. So those are 3 of the notes in the scale that I can use. Even if I didn't use any others, I can improvise in the C major scale. Just made that up. That's improvising. Doesn't sound brilliant, it's not going to sell any records, but that's just off the top of my head, improvising with just 3 notes from the scale. You don't necessarily always have to cover every note from the bottom to the top of the scale in your performance piece. You can choose a smaller amount of notes, and that's what I suggest for practicing. Just pick a few at a time and have a go at playing them, not in order. Probably sounds rubbish just like that. Doesn't matter. Just get used to not playing them to the order of what they are in the scale exercise. So make yourself a little chart, put your dots on it, and have a go at learning that shape. And in my next video, I'll actually cover some examples. I'll get the backing track on, and we'll play some examples of improvising.